Well, a huge part of it's fractured demoralization. Like one of the things I've really noticed, it's quite the stunning and horrifying thing to see. I think the biggest impact what I've said on young men has been my drawing of a relationship between meaning, adventure, and responsibility. It's like, well, and you touch on this in your book, like one of the things you point out. So let me take a bit of a sideways route here. When the big five theorists were laying out the semantic webs associated with negative emotion, neuroticism, McCrae, in particular with the Neo Big Five, noticed that self-consciousness and neuroticism were so tightly associated semantically that they were indistinguishable. So here's the rule. This is the rule. And you allude to this. If you think about yourself, you are going to be anxious and miserable. Those are the same thing. And you know that when you're possessed by a bout of self-consciousness. It's not pleasant. Okay, so then you might say, well, what do you do about that? And one answer would be, well, don't focus on yourself. But you can't not focus on yourself. You have to focus on something else. Okay, so what do you focus on if you're male? Well, you focus on responsible service to the future and others. Well, why? Well, because that gives you what you described as that slow dopamine kick. It's like that's where, and that's not happiness, it's meaning. Those are very different things. Happiness is that like hedonistic kick that can be hijacked by the AI machines. Meaning is less intense, but more sustaining. Okay, so where do you find that? And that's simple. You find that in the adoption of maximal responsibility. That's burden, that's challenge, that's play if you do it right. That's also the sacrifice that civilization is founded on. And one of the things that we might note, Jonathan, is that the default man is useless. Right? So, so for example, I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but I don't really care. So in the Arab world, broadly speaking, the Arab world produces about as much as Spain. Okay, well, why? Well, it's part of the reason is the men don't work. Now, that's not surprising. What's surprising is that any men ever work, because work is difficult and it requires sacrifice. And so the question is, and this is the anthropological question, the question of initiation, how do you socialize and civilize men? Because the default is going to be trivial hedonism. Of course it is, because it's easier. Of course it's going to be the default. The default's always what's simpler and more fragmented. Well, you tell them a story of heroic responsibility, and you draw, even more importantly, you draw a connection between responsibility and adventure. And so it's so interesting because so many men have reflected this back to me, and I literally mean thousands. Because I've said, what you do is you look for the maximum burden and you note that in service to that, you find meaning. And so you can do that with truth. You can do it with responsibility. And the young men will come up to me, and they do this daily, I would say, and say, 5 years ago, I decided I was going to start taking responsibility for myself and tell the truth. And like everything's changed in consequence, everything. And so what we're doing this bigotry of soft expectations with men. And one of the things I got right at the beginning was, see, the male attitude towards younger men isn't the feminine ethos of acceptance. So you could imagine the dynamic in a family is that this is a stereotype, but I'm going to go with it anyways. The mother says to the child, "You're lovely the way you are." And the father says, I kind of like you, but you could be a lot more. And those are good. Those are really good together, because when the child goes out from the mother, he's encouraged, let's say, by the masculine, go out. And then when he's exhausted, or she's exhausted for that matter, she can come back to the mother and be accepted. And that's the standard pattern of, security seeking and then exploration. Now, what I've been doing with young men is saying to them, you could be a lot more than you are. And it's an insult in a way because it means you're not good enough now, but it prioritizes the optimized future self. And that's actually hugely advantageous, And so I think what we're doing that's wrong with young men, well, and I think we're doing it to young women too in a more subtle manner, is not requiring or even demanding nearly enough. So they default to trivial hedonism, obviously.
Yeah, that's right. Let's keep going on this theme about adventure, challenge, burden. One of the most interesting findings that I came across when writing the book, in the chapter on play, I cover work by a Norwegian psychologist named Ellen Sandsider, who has an article from 10 years ago, where she goes through the 6 kinds of thrills. She says, thrilling play is the most powerful anti-anxiety agent. That is, kids will choose to do things where they can get hurt. They will choose to climb a tree to the point where they're scared, and then they'll go a little higher, and then maybe they'll stop. And then the next day they can go higher. Once you learn to bicycle over jump ramps and stairs. So kids are seeking thrills. And she says there's high places, fast speeds, dangerous tools, hiding, disappearing. There's a couple others, I forget what. Rough and tumble play, I suppose, of fighting is one. And she points out that it's that feeling of thrill. That's like, because, there's all kinds of imaginative games. Those are very nice. Imagination has all kinds of benefits. But it's like the most exciting play is where there's some danger. You might get hurt and you're maybe laughing and also afraid. And that kind of play is actually what dads specialize in. I remember when I was a kid, on the beach, like my father would pretend to be a monster, giant monster chasing us. And my sister, we'd run and we were kind of scared, but also laughing our heads off. So that's thrilling. And this is where I'm coming to see, my book has really caught fire with mothers in particular. Mothers were more concerned about this. They felt it more. And they're driving the efforts to get phones out of schools in general. Men are involved too, of course. But what I'm thinking nowadays is that dads in particular, really have a role to play in giving their kids more thrill and fear. Now, fear, I don't mean fear of them. I mean play that involves
exposure to fear.
Exposure to fear. Thank you. Yes, exposure to fear and risk. And that can even be just at an amusement park, just taking your kids to an amusement park where there's not really any physical danger, but man, it is scary when you go on a high roller coaster. So kids need that. It might be that boys need it more. At least boys need more rough and tumble play. That I'm confident. They need more rough and tumble. I don't know about thrills and fear. I just don't know. But our boys, I think, are suffering from a lack of adventure, challenge, responsibility. You said the soft bigotry of low expectations. And we need to give them back a world in which there are such possibilities to do something big, risky, great, thrilling.
I'm going to tell you a little story very quickly, I hope very quickly. I spent a lot of time recently assessing the Abrahamic covenant. And so Abraham is characterized as the father of nations, right? So you could imagine that he's emblematic of the pattern that maximizes reproductive success across time. That's a way of thinking about it biologically. The divine comes to Abraham as the voice of adventure, right? Because Abraham is wealthy and privileged, and he doesn't have to lift a finger, you see. And so he's 70 when the voice comes to him, and it says to him, you have to leave your zone of comfort and have your adventure in the world. You have to leave your tribe, you have to leave your family, you have to leave everything you're comfortable with. You have to do that voluntarily, and you have to make the sacrifices that are necessary in its pursuit. And Abraham agrees, and God offers him 5 gifts in consequence. And this is the alignment of the spirit of developmental adventure with the divine. And so here's the offer. This is the covenant. It's very specific. So the deal is that if you hearken to the voice of adventure and make the appropriate sacrifices, then you'll be a blessing to yourself. Your reputation will grow validly among your compatriots. No, your enemies will not be able to withstand you. You will establish something of enduring permanence, and you'll do that in a way that brings benefit to everyone. And so imagine what that means, Jonathan, is that developmental impetus to move out into the world produces that meaning because it's emblematic of expansion and development, and it aligns the psychological and the social, which is nothing but an expression of the fact that we are social creatures. Like, how could it be that our impetus to develop would be in contradiction to our social utility? It can't be that, because we wouldn't be social, right? We'd be essentially in competition with the social world. We wouldn't be aligned. So the call to adventure it's the Abrahamic call as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's also the antithesis of the selfish gene, because the idea in it is that if you imagine this, is that you embodied that adventurous spirit properly as a father, well, then you establish the pattern of adaptation that maximizes the reproductive fitness of your children. And obviously, like, what? You're going to raise a boy who's a cringing coward, and what? He's going to find a successful mate, and his children are going